Dear Korg, can I offer some suggestions relating to the new flagship workstation that we hope you are currently designing for us musicians? In December 2021, I became aware that the Korg Kronos had reached its end of life and was no longer being produced. As a keyboard player that has owned a Korg Kronos 2 since 2016, and as a YouTube blogger, I wanted to give some feedback on the features that your customers wanted to see in your next Monster Synth. Remember, like, comment, subscribe to the channel. Go over to Instagram and follow me there. Go over to Facebook, follow me there. That's where the normal notices are. And consider becoming a Patreon. Okay, let's start with the operating system. The bottom line is, even when the Korg Kronos was conceived 13 or so years ago, it was a 32-bit operating system, and it was almost dead at that point. Most of the big operating system, or the operating system manufacturers if you like, had already begun to retire 32-bit operating systems at the point this was conceived, in favour of 64-bit architecture. And as you expand the Korg platform to deploy the new flagship workstation, speed and capability are going to be extremely important for this new instrument. I've always been highly impressed with the polyphony and layering of the Kronos using the current 32-bit operating system. In fact, it's actually really impressive that you managed to achieve what you're achieving with little more than 3.5 gigs of RAM. And I know the theoretical limit of a 32-bit operating system is 4 gig, but in reality the most it ever takes is 3.5 gig. In fact, according to a technical expert, the RAM allocation on the Kronos is as follows: 1 gig to system, 2 gig to user, 1 gig unused. So we actually only get 3 gig on the platform anyway. To give the next machine the longevity that the Kronos has had, and the performance to leave its competition in its entrails, it's going to need a faster processor. It's going to need a 64-bit processor. It's going to need 64-bit processing. It's going to need at least 16 gigs of RAM. And the bottom line is, even the cheapest laptop nowadays comes as standard with 8 gigs. So why can't we have a keyboard that has at least 16? I was also surprised to find that the Nautilus was also a 32-bit operating system, which rather limits the longevity of the Nautilus as a platform, given that everybody else is now moving towards a 64-bit architecture. So Yamaha and Roland are going to be clicking on the heels of the Nautilus and the Kronos platforms. In fact, they already are, and pushing out 64-bit architectures. Why was Aftertouch removed from the Nautilus? Can we have it back, please? To be honest, I didn't realise how much I used Aftertouch until I played keyboards recently that don't have it, when I was kind of expecting it to be there. Why did you remove it from the Nautilus? And given the price point of the Nautilus, I'm surprised you did. The reality is being able to change the sound by using expression whilst playing has been commented by so many people on YouTube as a must for artist expression. Now we move on to the user interface. And I admit, I don't own a Nautilus, but I understand the screen on the Nautilus is actually smaller than the screen on the Kronos, which is 7 inches, which in turn is smaller than the screen on the Oasis, a keyboard I also own, at 10 inches. Please, can you not make the screen any smaller? In fact, I've always thought that the reduction of the screen from the Oasis to the Kronos was a regressive step. As the engines have grown and the level of information presented to the user has increased, the smaller screen makes little to no sense. The other thing the community has noticed about the Nautilus is the keyboard has fewer knobs and faders and buttons on the surface. And with functions being effectively moved to be managed by the user interface. I'm sorry, have you been listening to the user community? Personally, I use these knobs, sliders and buttons all the time when I'm playing this machine. It's quicker to see the settings, especially when playing live, visually without having to dive into a menu system. These faders over here I use all the time. I find them extremely useful. I don't really want to be diving through menus on a screen while I'm trying to do something else. It's far easier just to flick a fader, twist a knob while you're playing to get those settings that you require. I didn't understand Roland when they introduced the Jupiter X with a screen that can only be described as pathetic. It basically just about works to change settings and parameters on the keyboard, with little else being able to be done through that screen because it's too small. You need to be able to see more of the parameters, and you can't do that with a screen that is about that big, which is what the Roland Jupiter X is. So for basically editing patches, forget it. To be honest, the angles at which information can be viewed on the Kronos is impressive. I can sit down, I can sit on the stool, which is what I'm sitting on now, or I can stand up, and the angle of viewing is actually really good on this keyboard, and you have to be commended for that for picking a screen that allows that to happen. But others in the community have commented that a tilt mechanism like the Oasis would be useful for a full range of playing options. What I find is that if I'm playing and I'm standing up, I have to be almost there to look at this. Whereas with the Oasis, because the screen, I can actually step back. So I can actually step back. I mean, although I don't gig, but many in the community do gig, and being able to stand back to actually see visual cues from your drummer or your bassist or your lead guitarist or your singer is really important. And therefore, being able to tilt the screen slightly to allow that functionality would be really helpful. And while we're on the subject of user interface, can we have a VDU? This keyboard is so complicated that having a VDU, having a much bigger representation of the information that's being pulled off this would be really useful. Yes, I get the iPad app, okay, and it's really useful, but actually having a larger VDU for somebody to interact with would be really helpful. Now I know that this is built on a standard computer. The Oasis before it was the same, and the Nautilus that's come after this is, I suspect, the same as well. And they will have a standard VDU output. Now I know on the Oasis that if you take the cover off the back of it, you can see the VDU output, and it's routed to the screen. I don't know how you've done the routing on this because I've never really got under the bonnet and pulled it to pieces to see. But there is a VDU output. If you're going to use a more modern board on the new machine, it's going to have USB-C on it, which will allow you to transmit signals over USB to a monitor. So we could have a monitor that way. It would be really good to be able to, if you're in a studio set scenario, actually project what's going on your new keyboard up onto a monitor. It will be so much easier for the studio musician and the composition musician to be able to view the information. This is a simple thing. And while you're at it, can we have a keyboard and mouse interface so that we can, if we're going to use a VDU, we can use a keyboard and mouse the same way as we would use any other computer, so that we can actually start interacting with the machine rather than having to do touch screens on the screen itself. That would be really, really helpful. It's a VST, isn't it, after all? The 9 engines of the Korg Kronos and Nautilus are still looked at by many in the community as leading the way. But your competitors are nipping at your toes. If we strip the engine concept back, essentially these engines in Kronos speak are VSTs in computer speak. So can we have some more, please? I would love for you to develop a VST engine player for your legacy synths. For the early analog synths, we could have something where the knobs and buttons of those early analog synths are presented on screens, much like the engine that is on here for the Poly 6. You can dial in the parameters that you want and then you can save them off. But can we have some more of those legacy synths, not just the Poly 6? For later synths, can we have something that again would allow us to edit the patches on the synth? Can we have something that will allow you to emulate an M1? Can we have something that will allow you to emulate a Triton, maybe? Can we have something that allows you to input the sysx from the older machines and convert it into new machine speak, effectively using the VST to emulate what that old machine did? Either way, the artist gets the legacy sound on a modern platform without having to spend a lot of time with a keyboard tech to recreate it. I think the Roland Cloud concept has stolen the march on this piece, if I'm honest. And unusually I find Korg might be in a catch-up mode for this piece. Can we have a converter? Can we have something that takes old Oasis patches and converts them? Old Korg Kronos patches and converts them? Nautilus patches and converts them to whatever it is you're thinking about in the skunk works. Not having to recreate work already done is of vital importance to the musician who's going to move platforms. If you can make it seamless, you can make the sale. If you're going to create a 64-bit operating system, for the sampler, can we have the ability to create larger samples and use them in compositions? Can you add filters to the sampling section that allows us to emulate an 8-bit sampler, a 10-bit sampler, a 12-bit sampler, a 16-bit sampler? The legacy samplers of the era that we still resolve to. I mean, I do all the time to my older samplers to get the sound that I'm looking for from that 70s, 80s, 90s time period. It might be a good idea to have another look at the sampling workflow. Having a bigger VDU will help in editing samples and looping samples and making the sample playable on the Korg platform. Many people don't mention the sequencer on the Kronos. It's a very powerful tool. Again, with a larger amount of RAM, this leads us to options. The amount of data that can be held, the length of each song, the number of tracks we can process at any point in time. We've got 16 at the moment on the Kronos. Can we have some more? Of course, we as musicians will use as much as you, the supplier, give us. A feature I've really found useful on other instruments is the step sequencer, or the step concept. The ability to build blocks of phrases within your composition and then effectively reshuffle those blocks as if you were doing that in a DAW to different points within your composition without having to reprogram vast quantities of what it is you're trying to do. That has proved to be a really, really useful feature. It's a feature that's been present on drum machines for many, many years in terms of how to switch between patterns. But actually having that feature on a workstation, and unfortunately again I think Roland have stolen your thunder on this, to allow you to build blocks of phrases, not necessarily blocks of rhythm patterns, but actually blocks of phrases, blocks of music that you could then reinsert into different areas of the composition. That I think is an extremely powerful way of building compositions on your new workstation. Effectively a block song builder. These are features that your customers have been leaving on my blog. I will be in touch with other features that are being requested as they are placed on the blog. We hope the new workstation leaves the competition scrambling to catch up. Most of us are bought into the Korg ecosystem and into something like this because ultimately this is a beast of a workstation, and the next workstation has to be another beast to allow Korg to remain ahead of the competition and hopefully introduce another workstation that it takes 8 or 9 years for the competition to analyse, work out what they're trying to achieve and catch up. Live long and prosper, the Music Tech Guy UK. And on that note, I'll say bye bye.